Hello, and welcome back to the MVP, the Mass Violence Podcast, the official podcast of the National Mass Violence Center. I'm Dan Smith, the NMVC Director of Technology and Resources, and today I'm excited to introduce the first in a series of shared podcasts between the National Mass Violence Center and the International Association of Chiefs of Police, or IACP. The goal of this shared series is to highlight the different roles that victim service professionals and police officials play in the preparation for, response to, and recovery from mass violence incidents. In this first episode, you'll hear Dr. Michael Goodier, an IACP fellow, and Dr. Angie Moreland, the NMVC Associate Director, discuss what the National Mass Violence Center is, how we try to build capacity for responding to mass violence, and how the National Mass Violence Center and IACP overlap in their desire to help mass violence victims. We hope you enjoy this episode, which can also be found on the IACP Serve, Protect, Lead podcast. And we hope you'll come back for the other episodes in this series too. Enjoy the conversation between Dr. Moreland and Dr. Goodier.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of a special podcast series presented by the International Association of Chiefs of Police in collaboration with the National Mass Violence Center, or NMVC. I'm Dr. Michael Goodier, a program manager at IACP, and I'll be your host for today and throughout this podcast series. Here at IACP, I oversee the Mass Violence Advisory Initiative, or MVAI, a national program launched in 2022 and funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. MVAI is designed to support law enforcement and their communities before, during, and after acts of mass violence. Through peer-to-peer guidance, planning support, and trauma-informed resources, we aim to build resilience and ensure readiness at every stage of a crisis. But today, I'm proud to shine a spotlight on our longtime partners at the NMVC, which was established in October 2017 in partnership with the Office for Victims of Crime, part of the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs. The center is composed of a multidisciplinary team of scholars, researchers, victim assistance professionals, and technical experts, along with a broad network of partner organizations, like IACP, at the local and national levels. Together, they work closely with OVC to improve the nation's capacity to support victims and communities recovering from mass violence through research, planning, training, technology, and collaboration. Since NMVC's founding, IACP has been proud to partner with their team in bringing clinical research with practical law enforcement-centered approaches to mass violence response and recovery. Joining me today is Dr. Angie Moreland, a renowned expert in trauma and recovery, who serves as the Associate Director of the NMVC and Director of its Improving Community Preparedness Division. Dr. Moreland has extensive experience in the mental and behavioral health consequences of trauma, working across the lifespan with children, adolescents, and adults who've experienced a wide range of traumatic events. She specializes in the assessment of trauma-related concerns and the delivery of evidence-based, trauma-focused treatments. Through these leadership roles at NMVC, Dr. Moreland helps ensure that communities, public safety agencies, and victim support systems are equipped to respond to and recover from mass violence events with compassion, strategic planning, and evidence-based tools. Angie, thank you so much for being here today, and let's start with the basics.
Thank you so much, Michael.
So for those unfamiliar with the National Mass Violence Center, could you provide me with an overview of its purpose and go into how it was established?
Yes, absolutely. So as you said in the intro, we were established in 2017, and the purpose of the National Mass Violence Center was really to serve as a resource for mass violence response. And then more recently, we've expanded into being preparation as well, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little bit. But we were established, as you said, through the Office for Victims of Crime, Department of Justice, through a cooperative agreement. And up until 2017, there are a lot of great organizations, including IACP, who have been providing resources and just really evidence-based, up-to-date services, resources, different things that can help communities to address mass violence right after an incident occurred. So a lot of it was already out there. The problem is it wasn't really organized into a particular resource center. So in order to find those resources, it was kind of up to organizations or up to communities following a mass violence incident to piece together and find those resources and figure out what might be best for their community based on the incident, based on their community and the populations that were made up in that community, and also just who was directly impacted following a mass violence incident. So the purpose of establishing the National Mass Violence Center was really to serve as a hub where all of those resources could be established, and then really to have partnerships. So you were one of our very first partners at IACP, and having that partnership since 2017 is just really, really critical to our mission and to everything that we do. We are kind of experts in, not kind of, we are experts in the mental health realm, and really work closely with victimization and how to provide resources for communities following a mass violence incident and following victimization in general through our National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center, which we're housed under. But we don't claim to be experts in every field. You know, we're not experts in law enforcement and what law enforcement officers may need following an incident or how they could respond better to an incident. So really, we have those resources, and we serve as a hub to be able to assist communities, but those partnerships that we rely on, we have 20 different partners, and those partnerships are so that we can really expand out and really utilize the collaboration and the expertise among the entire field, really with the entire mission of being able to provide evidence-based victim services for those in need following a mass violence incident.
So you said there that it was sort of created to be a hub, right, for those resources to be in a central place. Are there any specific gaps or needs that were really foundational to creating NMVC to address these issues that we'll get into in the aftermath of mass violence?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a complicated one, because there's always, I feel like on every single call, on every single meeting that we have with our group, there's always new gaps and new needs that are coming up as we work with more communities. Initially, though, when we were first developed, it really was in that victim services, mental health space. There was a lot of great activities and great being done and great resources around victimization in general, but there weren't as many that were specifically catered to mass violence. And a mass violence incident, for those that aren't as familiar with this topic, it does have a lot of similarities to other types of trauma and other types of victimization. So someone who does experience a mass violence incident, so really a large scale incident that overwhelms the capacity of a community to be able to respond to that incident. So there's multiple different definitions throughout the field, but really OVC's definition, which we follow at the Mass Violence Center, is really that overwhelming capability to be able to assist. So those are the types of incidents that we think of with like school shootings, with large scale types of events where there's multiple different casualties that occur in those incidents. And while there's similarities to other types of trauma, there are some very unique aspects that are different. It really does impact the entire community. And we've done a lot of research within our organization to find out just how that is so. And what we found really is that even people who aren't present at the incident, so people who, weren't present inside of the church or inside of the school or on the street when the incident occurred, or family and friends, we know that those individuals are going to be impacted. They were there, they're impacted in much the same ways of other types of trauma. But this ripple effect with mass violence is huge, in that we have found both anecdotally through working with these communities, but then also through research with these communities, that there's really, really high levels of impact, both from a diagnosis standpoint, so levels of PTSD, of depression, kind of those general mental health diagnoses types of pieces, but also more broadly, that people in communities where a mass violence incident has occurred are much more fearful, and they are much more afraid that another incident will happen than in other communities. So really, that's getting back to your initial question about those gaps, is we really needed resources that would be able to address that need across the community and also address that need of the crime component on there. So a lot of times people and communities will compare their plans to natural disasters or to other kind of widespread incidents that occur in cities. And where mass violence is different is that it does have that crime, that victim piece to it, but it also has that targeted piece to it. So when a group of individuals knows that they were targeted because of some particular thing about them, the color of their skin, their race, their religious background, it just adds a whole nother layer to it. So that's where a lot of those gaps come up. And then the gaps that continue to come up is as we work with communities, they're constantly saying, do you have this? Is there something out there for this? And law enforcement is a big piece that tends to come up is, we'll get into this a little bit further, but questions always come up as we learn more about the mental health needs and the peer support needs of law enforcement following an incident, and ways that we can work with IACP and work with other law enforcement agencies to fill those gaps. And that's where kind of that resource hub comes in, is we'll look and see if it already exists in the field. And if it does not, then us in collaboration with our partners and our consultants will develop it and review it, and really have members of the communities review and assist to make sure we have that victim service component in there as well.
Building a bit off of that, I know that you guys fall under, the NMVC obviously falls under the Office of Victims of Crime, OVC. And so victimization is central to what you guys do, and you mentioned it in your response there a few times. How does that framing inform the NMVC's mission and work?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it really is ingrained in everything that we do. So from which we'll get into the planning and the response in a little bit, I think, but from the planning for mass violence all the way through that short-term response, so that immediate response that law enforcement officers are so ingrained in and so a part of, and then all the way through that longer-term response of, the weeks and months that come after a mass violence incident, and then in the memorials and in the 10-year, the 20-year, all of that recovery and healing stages as we go through victimization and victim services, it plays into all of those components. So really it's central to that mission in making sure that we're addressing the impact of that victimization, not only on those direct victims, we definitely do that, but also on that entire community, and making sure that everyone understands that the people that are impacted by mass violence goes very broad in a mass violence incident. And that victimization piece, although, there's different criminal and legal ramifications and definitions of that term victim and who falls under a victim, I'm speaking much more broadly that the whole community is victimized. And that victimization piece is very important to consider for everyone that's involved in that community.
Shifting gears just slightly, I wanted to ask you a bit about NMVC's partnerships and then the connection to the law enforcement audience. So how does NMVC work alongside law enforcement agencies and public safety personnel? How does that work when you all engage with those folks?
Yeah, so with law enforcement, the partnership is extremely critical. So it's not only, it's necessary, it's also just the closer the partnership can be with law enforcement, and I'm talking law enforcement from an actual community, so really working with those actual law enforcement groups that are involved, but also from a broader sense, like our partnerships with IACP and just with other law enforcement groups across the board. We really, really have to partner and make sure that we're working together at every stage. And we have several consultants and several chiefs that have responded to mass violence incidents that have mentioned this exact topic of, I was thinking of one chief who constantly says, we're really good at what we do. We're really good as law enforcement officers of going in and making the scene safe. So going and doing our job. I mean, that's what you train for. You train for all types of incidents that you're responding to. So a mass violence incident is no different. You're great at your job. You're great at going in, making the scene safe, apprehending the perpetrator, and making sure that you can move forward with both the investigation and also with the safety of the community. And where that partnership is so imperative that we've heard from many of these chiefs that have responded is that it goes much more broad than that it really is about working together and having law enforcement understand the role of victim services and the role, both from a planning perspective of how it's important for all of us to be doing this planning together and partnering together and making sure that we're all on the same page, but then also making sure that mental health and victim services is present at every single stage of the recovery process. So not only in those initial, minutes, hours, hopefully it's not longer than that, but sometimes it is, but also that it's ingraining that mental health and victim services into that, and that law enforcement is staying connected. And then it starts to go into the mental health and the needs of law enforcement. I mean, law enforcement officers are doing their job and responding, but that doesn't mean that they're not also impacted and that there isn't a victimization piece to that as well. So really understanding how working alongside each other, not only in the logistical sense, but also just in making sure that we're on the same page and communicating both for the recovery of that particular community, but then also for the planning in communities moving forward, that everyone needs to be at the table, that law enforcement, fire, emergency management, victim services, schools. I mean, we have a list of suggested partners and stakeholders that need to be present to make sure we're all working together and all making sure that we're thinking about the victims in a broad sense, from the planning all the way through that long-term recovery.
Before we get a bit more into the tools, resources, and things that NMVC offers, I wanted to ask you where you see synergy between your work and initiatives like MVAI that serve law enforcement specifically.
Yeah. IACP is is ahead of the game in terms of that you guys have a group, you have MVAI that is particularly focused on mass violence and being able to provide services directly for law enforcement following a mass violence incident. So I think, first of all, it's great to be working with an organization that already has something like that within their mission and within some of the dedicated work that is being done. Most of the other partners that we work with, mass violence is important to them and they understand the mission. But they're really relying on us for being able to pull in some of those mass violence expertise and components. So it's really refreshing and nice to be working with MVAI, knowing that is the mission. That's the dedicated piece. And I think the biggest piece with the synergy and with working together is making sure that we're collaborating, and it's not at all one versus the other. Everything that we're doing is overlapping with one another. And I think we've done a great job. I know I'm a little biased in this opinion because I'm one of the organizations we're talking about, but of being able to have that viewpoint from the very beginning of understanding what is the role of the Mass Violence Center as a whole and what resources are we developing and how can MVAI use those and adapt those and use those already established and already evidence-based pieces for law enforcement, and then how can it go the other direction as well. So really not reinventing the wheel and making sure that we have that synergy in both directions. And I think we both each have a specific kind of primary goal. So with the Mass Violence Center, it's really assisting the entire community and those individuals within the community, with law enforcement being kind of one of those pieces. Whereas MVAI, it's direct assistant. Their primary goal is for law enforcement and for those law enforcement organizations, with the secondary goal being the community. And ours is kind of in the opposite direction. So it's been really nice to work together and be able to build off of each other tools and be able to say, okay, we've developed this as a whole. Or one example is we said we've developed this alongside the Conference of Mayors. We have this timeline of events and we have what mayors should be doing. How can we take that and apply it to law enforcement? And then we've even gone a step further with some of the other organizations that we've worked with and said, how can we apply this to emergency managers? How can we apply this to fire? And really being able to take those pieces of expertise and incorporate them all together. And I think from a field, sometimes maybe it can get confusing of what is the role of this and what is the role of this group. But I feel like with MVAI, it hasn't been that way because we've been partners from the beginning. And even if someone doesn't understand that synergy or understand those roles, we're able to come in together and really explain how MVAI and the funding for MVAI and the resources can be applied guide and our resources, and they can work together and dovetail on one another.
So now that we've talked a bit about how the NMVC's resources are applied and kind of adapted right into the law enforcement space, what kinds of resources does NMVC really offer? I mean, we know that now that these are things that the law enforcement audience should be looking for, right? Should look to for some guidance, or just something that they might be able to adapt or use. But so what kind of things does NMVC offer to first responders, investigators, agency leaders?
A few different things. So I'll talk first about our resource guide. So this is one piece that may not be law enforcement specific per se, but is often utilized by law enforcement agencies and utilized to be able to really assist communities. Is right after a mass violence incident occurs, one of the very first things that the National Mass Violence Center does is puts together a one-page resource guide. And this is all pieces, everything that's on this resource guide can be found on our website, but our website is pretty massive. So if you go to the website, say you're involved, say it's a school shooting that's in your community, you have to look and figure out what resources would be for me and what would not. And a law enforcement officer or a law enforcement agency may not know how to parse through some of those or may not have the time. So really what our goal is to take the resources that we and our partners have that are specific to that particular incident and make just a one-page quick guide that has links to those resources. And those resources can be specific or can be helpful to law enforcement agencies, but really to the whole community. So one area that a lot of law enforcement agencies have used is oftentimes people go to you to say, what do we do? How do we help the community? Who do we tell? Where do we point the news channels to? And how do we get this information out there? And that's a really good resource that they can say this resource guide comes out within 24 to 48 hours after an incident. We try to do it as quickly as possible. And it really has those pointed resources that can be used. And that's one thing that I would recommend any law enforcement people that are listening on here to look for that resource guide. It's available widely. So we send it to IACP, and in most cases, I think IACP has been able to get it into the hands of that community and specifically of that particular agency that could use that. And then that's something that can be pushed out. So hopefully that's something from a resource standpoint that just takes that off of the plate of the law enforcement agency that's there. But also many of the resources that are on the page really deal with working with the media, what are trauma-informed responses, just kind of general questions that we get following a mass violence incident that oftentimes law enforcement agencies may be asking those same questions. And it may not be specific to law enforcement per se, but it answers a lot of those questions that law enforcement's receiving. And then what we've started doing a lot more frequently is putting resources, not necessarily on that guide sometimes, but then also distributing resources that can be helpful for kind of peer support and mental health for law enforcement, and also pushing them towards or pointing them towards the direction of MVAI as well. So being able to say, here's the resources that MVAI have. If you need something more broad for overall communities, we can back that up with the NMVC resources as well. Because being such leaders in the communities, law enforcement often gets a lot of questions that aren't just specific to the law enforcement realm or the actual, response that's happening. So being able to provide those and assist with those pieces. Another resource that we've been able to have is really just the immediate training and technical assistance. So because we are pretty open with what resources we're able to provide, there have been in many cases law enforcement or just other leaders in communities that have reached out and wanted to hop on a phone call or hop on a briefing to just really touch base and say, what resources do you have? I don't have a lot of time, point me in the right direction, because we know that the phones are going off and you guys are in a community when a mass violence incident occurs, you're tapped very, very thin. So being able to provide some of that technical assistance and consultation as needed, to even if it's just pointing you in the direction of things that you can send out.
So the resources and technical assistance that you talk about, obviously we know that the NMVC, the work that you all do is extensive and based in evidence-based practices. But how do you then take that and help law enforcement and communities incorporate that research and those evidence-based practices real time into crisis response and recovery planning?
Yeah, so a lot of that really is, like you said, it's based on that evidence and based on one of the pieces that's been very huge for our organization, and by organization, I mean, like I said, we're housed within the National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. And our center was established almost 50 years ago to really be a resource for victimization, both from a research and a clinical standpoint across the country. And that's kind of the foundation that we're built upon, is taking that research and what we've learned from an evidence-based perspective and really putting it into real time into the hands. So I think the research I talked about earlier is one piece of that, is taking what we've learned from communities. And that's one piece that has been extremely law enforcement specific, is that one of the main pieces that we've learned from communities that have experienced the mass violence incident is just how, like I said, how impacted their entire community is, which that is critical for law enforcement to know. So even in, the months, the years after an incident occurs, you're working within that community and you're responding to additional calls, you're responding to community incidents that happen, you're responding on an everyday basis, you're continuing to work within that community, and to know, based on research findings, that, every community is a little bit different, but we've surveyed enough communities that this is going to be consistent. Understanding that the whole community is really functioning on this high fear, high impact landscape. So knowing when you're going into a community, if they've experienced a mass violence incident, that fear is going to play into everything else that happens. And for law enforcement to understand that and be able to take that in their knowledge base and be able to understand that trauma perspective of really thinking of that community through a trauma lens, and how might they respond to a domestic violence incident? How might they respond to any type of other incident that occurs afterwards? It's going to be with this heightened level of fear, and it's going to be at a much different playing field than what happened prior to the mass violence incident. And then when you lay in other community violence that occurs on top of it, obviously a lot of communities have that lens as well. But really being able to take that research and what we know about that ripple effect and put it into our resources, and then be able to translate that for law enforcement and be able to say, this is why this is really important, and this is what you're going to be dealing with. So it's not just about the incident. It's about, what does the community look like after that incident, and how can I, as a law enforcement agency, take that into account in every practice that we do after that.
Touching there on the aftermath of an incident, and obviously there being a lot that you will need to think about and address in the longer term. What does the NMVC's research, or just research in general, show about that long-term recovery for both survivors of mass violence incidents and then also the professionals like officers who respond?
That's a very important and large question we could talk about all day, but I think that it's important to touch on, in that a lot of times when we think of a mass violence incident, we think of right away, we think of the scene, we think of what's happening right afterwards, we think of the people that are there and how they're impacted. And I think one of the largest lessons learned that we've really learned from actually a lot of the officers that have responded is really understanding that it's way past, and I think a couple of officers of you mentioned, like, way past that 24 hours or way past that 7 days or that 10 days, that recovery and resilience lasts a very long time in a community, but it looks a little bit different. So over time, and it's not the same for every person, but there is somewhat of a timeline, in that right after an incident, you really just have kind of this stage of shock. And this is a stage of shock amongst the victims, the direct victims, among the community, and amongst the officers that are responding. You're going to see a lot of heightened trauma responses. So people are scared, people have a lot of hypervigilance, some avoidance, and really are just trying to figure out how they're going to get their feet under them and figure out how they're going to figure out what's happened, There's funerals that occur in a community. There's oftentimes a lot of additional threats and additional safety measures and concern that happens. So really in that first, immediate aftermath, so that like very immediate recovery or immediate response, it's a lot of just kind of stabilization. So we talk towards a lot of evidence-based practices around that, around psychological first aid can be really great for officers and really great for communities. There's also a lot of just really short-term, more mental health stabilization types of resources that are needed, because that's not the time that we're going in and offering, all the officers, long-term mental health treatment or anything like that, or the communities. We're really stabilizing and functioning in this kind of high fear, high hypervigilance state. But then over time, that does start to change a little bit. And that's where, over the next weeks and months, we start to see people's resiliency coming through. And really, most people that experience a mass violence incident do not develop long-term PTSD or long-term depression. Like the default actually is resilience and for people to recover over time. And that's important for the community and individuals to know, and also for officers and agencies to understand that just by default, over time, you will start to heal and will start to feel better and start to come back to that baseline a little bit. But for some people, it is going to take a little bit longer and they may need more longer term responses. So it's over that next kind of weeks and months that we start to call it that kind of recovery phase where people are needing more mental health resources. Things might start to surface around the need for mental health treatment or need for peer support. I was working recently in response to a school that had a school shooting, and it was about the 6th or 7th month mark that we did some presentations and some consultation with the law enforcement agencies there. And they were mentioning that that's about the time that, they're starting to say, okay, I'm still kind of avoiding the scene of where that occurred. I'm still staying up at night, sometimes thinking about this incident. I'm still just really impacted by this, and it's not going away. And now, especially for law enforcement officers who it's part of the job. So people tend to think, I'm okay because I have to be, and I will recover because I have to, that it's around, those several months later that starts to come up with, oh, maybe I do need to reach out to some peer support, or maybe I do need to look into some of these resources. But then when you go even longer than that, into a year, 2 years, you have memorials, you have a lot of reminders that come up as time goes on. So really, the way that the stance that we typically take is you're never, like the recovery and resilience, there's not an end date to that. We don't have, 1 month you're going to be here and 1 year you're going to be here, but it really is that resiliency stage forever, in that it may look different, it may present different, but you really are in that long-term piece. And I think that's the important part for people who haven't been through a mass violence incident to understand, is it really is a marathon. Like it changes over time and the needs really change over time, but that this isn't something that is going to be, you're not going to completely get rid of it and say, well, we're not ever going to talk about that again, and now I'm healed and we're moving on. It becomes just kind of a piece of that community forever. And it's not always as impacting, but it definitely becomes this longer term piece that will always be. And there are post-traumatic growth there. It's not all negative, but it does definitely, there are stages of recovery and stages of resilience that last for a very long time.
Taking into account the differences, the variation that we can see in how people recover and how long they take to recover, if or feel that they've kind of healed somewhat, what factors influence, at least at the community level, a community's ability to heal following a mass violence incident?
This is where the research really comes into play, and where it's really, really important. Is one of the major things that we've learned, both through the research that we've done in our organization, but also just really relying on the partners and the evidence in the field in general, is that, like I said, most people are, the majority of people will recover, or communities will recover at a little bit different timelines. But month 6 will be better than month 2, and month 2 will be better than day 1. on, but a couple of factors that really play in. One is prior trauma. So at the community level and at the individual level. So what we know about individuals is if an individual, and this is law enforcement and non-law enforcement, if an individual has prior experience or prior exposure to other types of victimization. So if people have been through physical assault, sexual assault, for officers, if they have been on a very impacting critical incident or just do have prior trauma, then the symptoms of trauma following a mass violence incident are going to be higher, and their risk for PTSD is going to be heightened following a mass violence incident. So really looking at that individual level of what the person has experienced in the past and whether they've received treatment for that. So kind of where are they in their healing following that victimization? And that falls at a community level as well. So if it is a community that has experienced another mass violence incident or has experienced other levels of community violence, their risk for having a lot more impact is much higher. So really that landscape and what it looks like ahead of time is a risk factor for that. But there's also protective factors. So a major protective factor is social support and just levels of connectedness and ways that people can receive both at the individual and at the community level, those social supports following an incident. So if you combine those two things, the most at risk would be individuals or communities that have high rates of victimization and low rates of social support are at the highest risk. And then it kind of goes down from there. But one of the things that we would recommend because of that is really social support's a pretty low-hanging fruit. Like we can very easily build in social support and peer support in ways that people can feel connected ahead of an incident, and think about that so that when an incident or if an incident occurs, that's one thing that we can build in right after. And we know that at the individual and at the community level, that the more support from the community and the more resources and opportunities for togetherness and support, positive support following an incident, we know that that healing just looks a lot better. They're able to heal at a much quicker and at a much more successful rate.
I think
one more thing, which was it also builds on, Michael, to a lot of IACP's missions. I mean, a lot of what you guys do is that, community and that peer support piece. So really, that's one of the things we love about working with IACP is you already have that mentality and are starting to improve that across the country. In a lot of agencies, the importance of that connectedness and that peer support, and that plays into the mass violence piece as well.
Absolutely. I think that that's a crucial piece of advice and insight for any law enforcement leaders listening, when they want to think about something to improve wellness for both their victims and their own personnel, any victims right in the community.
Absolutely.
I think you've given us a lot to think about. So I just have a few more questions before we wrap up this discussion. Are there any current initiatives, trainings, upcoming projects that you'd be excited to share with the audience, with our listeners?
Yes. So we're working very closely with IACP, so specific to law enforcement, to be able to develop some of the resources that MVAI is putting out. So a couple of law enforcement specific pieces, I would say would be around kind of some of these toolkits and timelines. So one of the pieces that we're working closely with is trying to take these overall resources that we know and build them in or adapt them and make sure that they're relevant for law enforcement. So I would say any of those specific resources around that. But then what I would highly, highly stress is the planning component. So really knowing every law enforcement, I mentioned the chiefs before, but officers that we've talked with who have been through a mass violence incident, their biggest lessons learned really are the importance of planning and partnership ahead of time. So I would say really looking towards the improving community preparedness piece of the National Mass Violence Center. All of our resources are important, but something that can be done now would be to start doing those planning components. So within part of our training and technical assistance, the preparedness division works specifically with communities, and this is at all different levels. So we work at the state level, the city level, county level, basically anyone who reaches out and says, we would like your help. We've worked with school systems and hospital systems of being able to say, could you take a look at our plan and let us know how well we're incorporating victim services and what can we do to help to incorporate some of those? So basically to take the lessons learned that we have and help communities to go ahead and build in a lot of that so that it's that preparedness piece is there and that you feel more prepared. And then also helping to build up those partnerships. So within communities, I think communities are doing a much better job at this over the past decade of getting everyone together in the same room. But I cannot stress enough the importance of like law enforcement, fire, emergency management, victim services, everyone working together prior to the incident happening and already having built in. So like in this incident command structure, how can we build in victim services? Who needs to be at the table? Who can we call? So really knowing all of that ahead of time, because number one, it helps out with the response. But I think where it also really helps out law enforcement is something that one of our chiefs, who's a consultant with us, always mentions is communities, when you have trust from the community, they are much more likely to work with you and the response is going to be so much cleaner and better. So if you can be building that trust amongst partner organizations in a community ahead of time and already display that to the community when a mass violence incident happens, you're already ahead of the game. So I would say those resources, looking on our website, and we can provide all of that information to reach out and go ahead and ask for that training and technical assistance and have us provide the resources that we have so that you can get that ball rolling on the preparedness piece. And we step in as little or as much as needed. So we're able to assist with just kind of brief consultation and a couple of trainings, or we can literally sit down with communities and walk through every stage of the response and what we've learned that might be needed.
I love that you mentioned trust there. That's something that obviously the IACP does a lot of work in trying to develop and promote community trust. So that's another area of synergy, I think, between the two organizations. We started by looking back a little bit, right, at how this partnership started. But as it continues to develop, the partnership between IACP and NMVC, what do you hope it accomplishes? And I know this is a big question, but both in the immediate future and further down the road, what are some things that you'd like to see it accomplish?
I think really just continuing that synergy and building upon it. So I think what we've learned, and I'm sure all organizations have learned this in partnership, is that it's not a box to check off. It's not something where we say, okay, we have the partnership, we've built the resources, check, law enforcement's done, or check, victim services is done. I think it's really important to continue that partnership and really building based on the new gaps and the new needs that come up. Like I mentioned this earlier, but it's unbelievable to me how often a community will say, do you have this resource? Can we have this? I'm like, we didn't even think about that and it doesn't exist. Let's figure that out. And I think if IACP and NMVC can continue, which I know we will, but that partnership moving down, then as those gaps come up, we can continue to work together to figure those pieces out. And also, unfortunately, crime changes and mass violence changes and it looks different. And people figure out ways to do things and ways to target people in communities that are just different all the time. So I think continuing this partnership so that we can stay ahead of it and make sure that we're meeting victims' needs and community needs and officer needs as they arise and as new needs come up so that we can continue to make sure that we're developing the best practices and having those collaborative trainings and really making sure that we're building off of each other to continue that synergy, because I think it only continues to build the field and make it stronger.
I think that's a perfect way to end today's discussion. And I'd have to start by saying that thank you again, Angie, for sharing your time, insight, and expertise with us and our audience today. I can say on behalf of my colleagues at the IACP that we're really grateful for your continued partnership and for everything you and the NMVC team do to contribute to this work. You've given us, I think, a lot to think about today, and more importantly, a clearer picture of what meaningful, research-driven support can look like after mass violence. But before we wrap the episode up completely, I know there are probably folks out there listening who want to learn more, get connected, or even bring some of NMVC's tools that you've mentioned, that we've kind of highlighted, into their own communities. So Angie, where should they start? What's the best place to go find out more about NMVC and the resources that you guys offer that might apply to each agency's unique needs?
Yes, great question. So I would say go to our website is the first page. So it's www.nmvvrc. So it's a little bit longer. But on there, you'll see how to reach out to us. You'll be able to go through the resources and just reach out directly. And what we typically do first is just set up a call where we'll just very informal say, what do you need? What are you looking for? And that way we're able to point you in the right direction, whether it's resources that we have or resources that we're able to provide, or connecting us with some of our partners who may have some of those resources as well. So I would say the website's the best place to go. And I think you probably could also reach out to Michael and reach out to IACP too. So really making sure that we are connecting with one another and making sure that we're sharing those resources. And I'll say, Michael, as well, we feel the exact same way, that we appreciate the partnership so much with IACP and just really know that the field is a better place and we're able to provide more to victims and to agencies and law enforcement in general because of this partnership. And we just really value the contributions and the work that we've done together.
I think this whole conversation has been a strong reminder that we're not in this alone, everyone out there as well, that they're incredible people and organizations like NMVC working to build these stronger, more resilient systems of support. And yeah, we're just so honored to work alongside you. And I really think that people will hear this and feel compelled, I imagine, to reach out and contact you. But like you also said, if anyone wants to learn more about the IACP's MVAI, Mass Violence Advisory Initiative, you can visit our project page at theiacp.org/projects/Mass Violence Advisory Initiative. But with that, I think this wraps up our first episode in this special podcast series in collaboration with the National Mass Violence Center. And I'd just like to say to everyone out there, thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us again next time.
Thank you.